Hello, and thanks for joining us today for session 2 of the Australian Human Rights Institute's conference on accountability in crisis. I'm Justine Nolan. I'm the director of the Australian Human Rights Institute here at UNSW, and I'd like to begin by acknowledging the Bejigal people on whose land UNSW stands and pay my respects to their elders past and present, and all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who are joining us today. This session follows the first session we had this morning, and today we're going to be looking at the decline of accountability and the erosion of rights. We've got a stellar panel that's going to speak to you today, including human rights practitioners, media and business representatives, along with human rights advocacy who have been focusing on really important issues that are both global and local. We're going to focus on practical examples showcasing the decline of accountability and the methods that all of our experts are using to protect human rights, both in Australia and internationally. We're going to be exploring the intersections between accountability and democracy through the lens of issues like climate change, corporate responsibility, technology, and democratic institutions that are under threat. We're going to explore the role that individuals and NGOs play in holding institutions to account, and the role of media as both a sort of part of the problem and a solution to questions around accountability. So let me begin by introducing our expert panel. Today, we're fortunate to be joined by Larissa Baldwin-Roberts, who is the CEO of GetUp, an independent movement of more than 1 million people working to build a progressive Australia. Brynn O'Brien is the Executive Director of the Australasian Centre for Corporate Responsibility, ACCR, a shareholder advocacy and research organisation working to drive real-world emissions reductions across the economy. Lizzie O'Shea is the founder and chair of Digital Rights Watch, which advocates for human rights online, and is a principal lawyer in the Class Actions Department of law firm Maurice Blackburn. Siobhan Toohill is Westpac's Chief Sustainability Officer, and her role includes sustainability governance, climate change, and human rights. And Christopher Warren, an Australian journalist and writer. He's currently the media correspondent for Crikey, an independent Australian source for news and analysis. So let me begin by sort of just setting the scene a little bit on why we decided to focus on this topic of accountability. And we're certainly not short of examples of either domestically or globally where our institutions have been found wanting in terms of accountability. Most recently, there's been a lot of attention on the government's robo-debt scheme, the former government's robo-debt scheme, which caused untold and avoidable human suffering. And it was described by a Liberal Party MP, Zoe McKenzie, as one of the poorest chapters of public administration in Australian history, and out of sync with notions of personal responsibility and integrity in government. Rio Tinto's destruction of Juukan Gorge a few years ago, more recently, the PwC tax leak scandal, and privacy and data breaches at multiple companies, both in Australia and internationally, are example of a lack of responsible conduct and where accountability has been seen by many as lacking. But perhaps one of the most ominous displays of moral blindness by government, in collaboration often with corporate Australia, has been the ongoing approval of fossil fuel products as we hurtle towards irreparable damage to our planet. Former Fire and Rescue New South Wales Commissioner Greg Mullins has declared that the federal government's persistent sale of coal and approval of new coal mines as incomprehensible, given the government's acceptance of the science of climate change. So let's kick off on that topic with some examples around the issues of climate. And if I turn to you first, Brynn, what does accountability mean to you in this context of climate change and how it's being debated? And do you see that there's an accountability deficit in relation to discussions on the climate crisis?
There's certainly an accountability deficit, but accountability is kind of something that happens later when there's an acceptance that something is wrong, something quite specific is wrong, and then an increasing alarm or outrage in society about that wrong. And while I think in Australia and globally, we have accepted in a way the science of climate change, we have not yet accepted what it calls on us to do, which is to stop emissions going up. And there's this kind of new kind of denialism about the consequences of not accepting that and not taking action. So while in the last federal election, the Labor Party says that they won that election on a climate mandate, as you say, they are continuing to expand Australia's fossil fuel export profile, fossil fuel production profile, and that is totally at odds with even a basic understanding of what needs to happen. So I would say there's an accountability deficit, but there's also an alarm deficit, an outrage deficit, and I think that is a precursor to the accountability. So what needs to happen is that emissions need to go down. They're still going up. The IEA has predicted, so the International Energy Agency has predicted that globally demand for fossil fuels will peak before 2030, but I just want to note that it's 2023 and fossil fuel demand has not yet peaked. New fossil fuels projects are being opened up all the time. And this is permitted by governments and pursued by corporations. So this is a real problem for us. I would say that legal, social, and political accountability is always a lag process. It comes after harm, and our focus needs to be on preventing harm, because unfortunately for us, there is one kind of accountability that we can't avoid, that is coming for us whether we like it or not. It is physical, the accountability of the physical world. So we are very, very fast approaching physical limits that once transgressed, you cannot undo. So we are approaching concentrations of carbon or greenhouse gas emissions in the atmosphere that will lead us to tipping points like huge diebacks of the Amazon rainforest. We've seen in the last couple of years the Amazon rainforest going from a carbon sink to a carbon source. That is like deeply, deeply troubling. These processes and the planetary boundaries that we are now pushing up against are contributing to a really sick world, to a world that is less resilient and less able to deal with, is less able to use its own systems to fix the problem. So that is, unfortunately for us, a physical accountability that is we are hurtling towards, and we really need to be focused on the actions that will present us going over those physical limits right now, and we certainly don't see any of that from the government in Australia, most governments worldwide, certainly not from the corporate director class in Australia either.
So let me follow up on your first point where you talked about sort of this denial of alarm status. And part of that comes from the notion of what information is out there, what people are hearing, what people believe. And in our session this morning, we had a little bit of a discussion around the role of the media and misinformation and disinformation. And I'm going to come to you in a moment, Chris, to talk about that. But first, I want to sort of get a practical example from you, Larissa, around during your work with GetUp. I mean, when you're seeking accountability, you're working in an advocacy organisation, and you've obviously been one of the lead organisations campaigning for The Voice, most recently in Australia. So how do you think about accountability in terms of combating that level of misinformation and disinformation, and how are you addressing it, but also what are you confronting in that realm?
I would say a couple of things about mis and disinformation. Like, we are, in a way that I think we've never seen it. It has been mobilised in a federal campaign in the referendum, and I think there's some things that kind of created that space where, referendums are a binary choice. Culture wars help create mis and disinformation. But I think also at its core, mis and disinformation doesn't just exist online because of lack of information. It exists because of bots, because of people who want to undermine democratic institutions as well. And so you see on particularly in the Voice campaign and the referendum, we're seeing an overwhelming influx of, bots and that sort of stuff, creating conversations, saying things that, are beyond the pale and really racist, and lots of, confusing people and that sort of stuff. And there's no regulation around that. That's one thing. But the other thing that is really hard is that the average person, like we talk about the difference between left and right, but actually the biggest divide is between people who consume political news that you have to seek out and people that don't. And so the idea of mis and disinformation can become really deadly in a scenario like the referendum, because you see, one, people don't know that it's not real. And some of the arguments that are being had there, and because they're seeing people that are looking like, it's AI or it is people that have been enabled through mis and disinformation, they're repeating these things. And we're seeing it, it's not just in this campaign, we're seeing it also how it moves through different age groups, particularly in the referendum. Women under 45 who have never voted Conservative are likely to vote no in this referendum, who are typically an audience that would be gettable for First Nations justice issues. And one of the things that we think is affecting them is the idea around this being a culture war. When it moves into a fringe debate, people don't want to, and who don't feel equipped to be within the argument or an expert, they step out and they disengage. And I think on the other spectrum, we're seeing a lot of young people who are an incredibly empathetic generation. But if you have a look on TikTok and what's being said right now, there is so much mis and disinformation being repeated. And it's almost this contest of who has the most fringe ideas, and people kind of using that as knowledge. And what's missing within that debate is it's a really dehumanizing story that you're telling about First Nations people. And I think that we're seeing this through the influence on policy as well. Our politicians are really influenced by what they're seeing online. The easiest way to make things go viral is to start an argument. And, I've had disability advocates tell us throughout the Royal Commission and stuff like that, and different policy advocacy work that do inside track work that they've been doing, is getting back responses from politicians that, I don't think this thing is, resonating with the voters out there. It's not popular. And then stating stories and messages that are definitely what we're seeing is influx into our organisation as bots. So there's a lot of work to do to overcome that. And I think for us, this referendum campaign is a really big moment to reflect on what is the role of the media and what information, and do you cover political fights in terms of a two-horse race, and what information do voters actually need and how do you get that to them. But I think more as well in civil society, we do not have the capability right now to overcome this. We've seen the far right, the Conservative Political Action Conference come in and seriously step up the game of the No campaign. And we need to work on what our capability is, because getting the truth out there to people is so critical to creating change.
Yeah, I mean, that's a really good point around this sort of the value of the truth and transparency in seeking accountability. So Chris, I'd invite you to come in and sort of, you see as I said at the start, media being both, people see it as part of the problem, people see it as part of the solution. Larissa's talking about, the need for civil society organizations to have to step up and counter this. But, the reality is that often they don't have the resources or ability to do that. So there is still, whether it's issues that are exploding in the world this week around Israel and Palestine, or The Voice, we're seeing, multiple sources of information come out. So how do you see the role of the media, and more broadly, potentially social media, because crikey, you're getting a lot of your audience online as well, in addressing this?
Well, I wouldn't say the media were part of the problem. I think the media are the core of the problem, particularly in Australia, where the media is dominated by News Corp and News Corp media, and almost all the kind of fake news or sham news, which is, I think, often a better way of thinking about it, that gets circulated, originates within the News Corp ecosystem. A large part of the power of News Corp is not their ability of talking to their specific audience, which is actually quite a small audience. It's hidden behind a paywall. It's demographically very constrained, mainly men over 60. But the problem is the power they have in setting the news cycle for all the other media, particularly media like the ABC, which is clearly deeply intimidated by News Corp and concerned to protect itself against News Corp. So I think the existence of News Corp, the News Corp business model, is one of the core drivers of the polluted information environment that we live in Australia. Not just because of what they do, but because of the way the rest of the media, the rest of the traditional media at least, react to that. And one of the ways that the rest of the media reacts to that is to undermine the way in which this has been dealt with globally, which is through the emergence of new media. And so the result of that is that new media is seen as somehow, like Crikey, for example, but not just Crikey, is seen as somehow outside the media, the real media environment, and doesn't get the support from say the ABC or other organisations that would enable it to put a counter voice. I compare that to, say, New Zealand, where the public broadcaster Radio New Zealand is one of the really active supporters of the emerging new media environment within New Zealand. So until we as journalists acknowledge that actually we are a large part of the problem, and start to address it in a holistic way, then we're not really going to be able to clean up or hold this polluted environment to account in the area of both fake news and sham news. And I think that's particularly true in the area of climate change.
Yeah, I mean, and one of the things, Lizzie, that Larissa mentioned when she was speaking was the fact that there is so little regulation, or in some places, no regulation almost, around this use of media and technology, etc. Now, in your experience, looking at that, how do you see that? Some people would see technology as the great enabler, the great equalizer, where people have access to more information, and obviously, the old idea of, the more information out there, the more transparency, sunlight being the greatest disinfectant. But we know that, from what Chris is saying too, is that not all information is equal, or not all forms of media or release of media is equal. So how do you see sort of the role of technology in this debate around accountability? You see it more as a problem, or more as a tool to seek accountability?
Thanks, Justine. It is an ambitious question, and it's an ambitious topic. I'm grateful for the opportunity to participate in this discussion, because sometimes I think these questions are left unexamined, which is a problem. But I do want to just acknowledge the breadth of it. I mean, I suppose I'd say about the general idea of technology is I'd probably refer to the great historian of technology, Melvin Kranzberg's first law of technology, which is that it is neither good nor bad, but nor is it neutral. And I think, in my view, what I've seen as an observer of this space is that it is really a function of power, how it's deployed in these different kinds of settings. Which refers me to the other maxim from Stafford Beer, the founder essentially of cybernetics, who made the claim that the purpose of a system is what it does, and that in respect of technology, I think technology has a particular role to play, I think, in concealing accountability or forms of accountability, or transparency around who ought to be held accountable, understated intentions, and that this really does involve inflicting huge amounts of harm on people who are forced to endure it at the hands of the powerful. And so what I would say, I suppose, is that at least in the information space, there is a really interesting discussion that's now going on that has advanced significantly in recent times. So Mark Zuckerberg once said a little while back, and he's never repeated it, I think for obvious reasons, that he revealed that how he perceives Facebook is much more like a government than a traditional company. And that's in part because he has the capacity to dictate policy, including on some of these topics we're discussing, about how information is shared, what the public space looks like, whose rights get violated, who gets to say what they want to say, who gets to shape that narrative. And that I think the addendum to that comment is that he's wholly unqualified and largely uninterested in doing much about the collective problems that this presents. So people often think about regulation of technology as being a simple, straightforward response to a lack of accountability in this space. I think it is more complex than that. There's multiple ways in which technology can be regulated. It can be regulated in respect of individual rights to protect people from harmful business models. It can also be regulated in a consumer setting or in a competition setting to look at how some of these companies have too much dominance as platforms, and that has implications not just for people's rights as consumers to get things for good value, or to be able to access goods and services on an equal footing in the marketplace, but also that they're subject to predatory marketing and a whole business model around predatory marketing. But more generally, and probably what I'm most concerned about, is that the erosion of collective rights That is the right to a public space that is functional, where the capacity to speak, to be heard, to have some sense of central truth is fundamentally compromised by a data-driven business model. And that governments also are complicit in some of these erosions of rights, of collective spaces. And that, I think, is the big problem in relation to technology. Who is big enough to regulate these massive companies that are operating more like governments than private corporations? And we often look to government, and I think that's an important place to look, but governments are often complicit in taking some of the spoils of this kind of mass surveillance technology that's being established, and are prepared to be critical of technology companies, but also use them to their advantage when they see fit. And I think then it does, raise some of the questions that have been asked by other members of this panel. What is the role then of civil society, of people involved in the technology sector, about building alternative technologies, about supporting ideas of human rights, to be able to build out an alternative to just relying on sheer regulation as the answer to some of the problems that at the level of complexity that we're seeing in relation to technology.
So, I mean, that's a good point that you raised around, sort of the role of regulation, the role of individuals, the role of civil society. But what you've all touched on also is the role of corporations, about how you shape the narrative. So, Siobhan, I wanted to come to you in terms of thinking about, the role of corporations. 30 or 40 years ago, your role didn't exist generally in companies. Right. There wasn't a sustainability, officer looking at it. And now some companies are making great strides in that area. Some are, burying their heads in the sand, and some are being negative, being obstructionist around it. So how do you sort of negotiate, I guess, this minefield, which is now that corporations are expected to respect human rights, are expected to understand and respect that they have a role in relation to social issues, and we've seen this debated in Australia in particular. But how do you think about accountability and the role of corporations?
Yeah, I mean, it's so important. Our reflection for Westpac is that we recognise we've got a really important role to play. We're clear that we respect human rights, and for us, it kind of starts with asking the question: could we? But in fact, should we? And for us, we're very much guided by the UN guiding principles on business and human rights. But what does that actually really look like? It's about kind of really, I guess, unpacking that in terms of understanding what is our role. What is our role as a lender? What's our role as an employer? What's our role as a purchaser of goods and services, our role as a supporter of communities, and then reflecting on then how we govern that, how we talk about that, but most critically, actually, how do we do that? And that's really very much a program of engaging our frontlines to help them understand what we expect them to do. So, for example, when it comes to lending, we expect that our bankers are working through ESG risks, that we are strengthening their capability to understand their roles around undertaking due diligence, for example. Or when we get it right, I get it wrong, reflecting on what is our role and what is it we need to do around that particular matter, and speaking to those examples. And I think increasingly it's not just around human rights, but also it's around how these themes actually start to intersect. And so we're seeing increasingly a deeper expectation and understanding around how climate change and human rights intersects, or around how human rights and responsibilities around nature intersect. And again, what is our role as a bank that cuts right across the economy, and how do we think about it, particularly in relation to the different sectors that we bank, but also, as I said, as an employer and our role more broadly in the community. So we also undertake a process around thinking about what are our most salient issues each year. It's discussed at various governance levels within the organisation as well. And we also seek the perspective of external stakeholders, including civil society, in terms of how we arrive at what we deem to be those most salient themes. And we're actually undertaking an even deeper dive around that at the moment. But, not surprisingly, some of the topics that come up for us as those most salient themes are around privacy, consent, transparency. For us as a bank, we've got to respect the privacy of our customers, their personal information, but also of our employees. Data and emerging technologies, thinking about what are our responsibilities around the role of AI, how we work through that in a really appropriate way. And of course, the issue and the role that we play around understanding the principles of free, prior and informed consent. So as a supporter of the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights and the UN Declaration of Rights of Indigenous Peoples, now when we are banking certain sectors, we need to better understand what do we need to understand in relation to how FPIC or free, prior and informed consent has been achieved or worked through in relation to a specific project or a specific organisation. And I think, we're beginning to understand it's not just the traditional sectors, but in fact, it's playing out in a raft of different sectors as well. And then, as I said, the intersections, particularly around climate change and environment. So really understanding things like just transition. What is our responsibility? What's the role of a bank in relation to just transition? And I think in particular that emerging really thorny topic of clean technology, how it's being manufactured, what are the modern slavery risks perhaps. So we're seeking to achieve delivery of renewables, but there may also be significant questions around the technology that we're using and what is our role in terms of applying leverage to address better outcomes. I guess I'll come back to the importance of risk assessment and the role of governance and how we escalate those sorts of risks. And certainly in banks, this is taken very seriously. I was in a discussion this morning, for example, where a matter was escalated for a higher level discussion with more senior executives to work through how do we approach this decision, what information do we need in order to be able to make that decision. And then I just want to go back to the earlier discussion that we had around the voice. So for us, Westpac, we're Australia's first and oldest company, and we have a significant presence in remote communities. So we as an organisation have decided that for this topic, it is an important one for us to take a position. And we have as an organisation said that we do support a voice, but at the same time respect the views of our employees and our customers. And that we believe that a voice is a really important mechanism to address the gap and improve wellbeing outcomes for First Nations Australians. We think that's in our best interest as a bank. And that's, as you can imagine, a really complex topic to work through and the level of discussion and governance required around that. But most importantly, that we've consulted. And in fact, that decisioning has been led by our First Nations employees, as well as discussions with First Nations leaders, and of course then taken through to the most senior levels of the organisation. And importantly, given the complex environment we face into at the moment and that negative environment, that we've placed support around our employees as well, in particular appointing an elder in residence to support our employees as they face these kinds of issues and addressing those aspects of human rights and the risk of harm to our people.
So one of the things I want to sort of open up more broadly to the group, and I invite any of those who are joining us today to put comments or questions in the Q&A box, and we'll get to them as we go along. But we've been talking about some of the problems around accountability and accountability deficits. One we highlighted was a lack of transparency, misinformation, disinformation. But another one is around leadership and sort of this notion of shared responsibility around a lot of things. And so far we've touched on government, we've touched on corporations, we've touched on civil society, individuals, even international institutions, the media. And so of all the issues that we've talked about, whether it's government mishaps, corporate mishaps, climate voice and other issues, sometimes there's this notion of shared responsibility. And I sometimes feel that when we sort of focus on shared responsibility, then there's no one's responsible because we're so busy dispersing that responsibility around. And Brynn, if I could come back to you, and if you think about leadership as a key to accountability in the climate space, how do you think about that? And, who are the key players here? Because so much is like, go home and turn off the lights and everything will be solved. And, it's like, well, put it back on civil society and, come back and the media. So how do you think about leadership as a value of accountability and pushing it in your area?
Well, I mean, it's pretty simple in some ways in Australia. So leadership could be shown by the federal government in saying we're not going to permit, we're going to act in line with the science, and we're not going to permit new fossil fuels exploration and expansion. We're not getting that kind of leadership. In fact, I think there is a legal case run by Environmental Justice Australia against Tanya Plibersek, the Environment Minister, that will be the decision will be handed down today about exactly that question: is do you need to consider climate harm when you're making decisions about exploration and expansion projects? So we're not seeing that leadership, and I think that the way that we need to change that is to create political pressure. We're not really seeing corporate leadership, and I guess the challenge to organisations like Westpac and the other major banks, whose literally future business depends on society, regulation, and economy in which their business activities can occur, which is under threat from climate change. If people don't understand that, I just need to emphasise that everything is on the line, that financial markets are absolutely on the line, that the society and the economy in which Westpac and other major banks operate is at risk here, very, very grave risk, and very, very soon. So what we could see, and the challenge would be, is for the businesses and the business leadership that understands this, and there are lots of business leaders who do understand this, to start acting like it, to actually start saying, well, there are a handful of companies in Australia, both Australian listed companies and foreign multinational companies, that are still pursuing fossil fuels exploration, expansion, extraction beyond our planetary limits. And it is to recognise that those business activities are a direct threat to other business activities, like the business of the major banks and institutional investors, and to hold them to account. So to have this kind of peer-to-peer leadership. But really, you know, Tanya Plibersek could make these decisions today, and that's what she should be doing.
I mean, so you're saying that, I mean, because I want to come back to, I think it was Lizzie's point earlier around the role of regulation as well, which is particularly lacking in the tech space. But when you're saying that, Brynn, are you saying that we need regulation? Like you would look first to government? That's where you're looking first, and then...
Well, we don't need any new laws. The existing laws could deal with this problem now. The existing processes that the Environment Minister and the Prime Minister oversee could put an end to fossil fuels expansion in Australia, absolutely. And we're not talking about switching the lights off overnight. We're talking about an orderly transition, a just transition for Australia's economy, Australia's export economy, into something entirely different that does not put everything we know and love at stake.
Yeah, I mean, and Lizzie, you sort of talked about, you know, the value of regulation or the lack of regulation. So particularly in the tech space, we see a lack of regulation in at the moment in social media, in AI, etc. Is it the law that's going to solve this, or do you think it's, you know, we need people to act, we need civil society? What is the magic sort of lever that you think would push accountability more?
Unfortunately, I don't think there is a magic lever, but I understand that there is a role for regulation to play. I mean, it's why I spend a huge amount of time putting in submissions about law reforms that are proposed by government or general inquiries. There are models also for laws we could easily apply in Australia that we don't. You know, we are going through a review of our Privacy Act at the minute, but it's been largely untouched for 40 years in a context in which technology has quickly outpaced the capability of these laws to respond to the scenario we're in. So, you know, absolutely there's a role for lawmakers to update our laws to reflect concerns that are presented by technology and to make sure that ideas like privacy reflect what are community conceptions of those rights in law, which they currently don't do. And in places like Europe, even in the United States, there are better protections for these things that just don't exist in Australia. So we're miles behind. And in part of it, I think, is that we don't have a Human Rights Act. So, you know, lawmakers need to wake up to this, start acting as quickly as possible. I'm pleased to see the Attorney General at least is planning to move on privacy, which is a huge step forward, and I would welcome that. I mean, I think it's interesting to think about whether there is a similar kind of idea that could be applied that Brynn was just talking about, whether corporations need to start treating the crisis that has been created by new technology with a bit more seriousness. And I would say my experience of observing large technology companies, whether they're the major platforms that most people are familiar with, but also large artificial intelligence companies and other companies operating at the edge of developing technology, is that they largely have no concern for the welfare of individual people or for collective institutions and collective spaces that are facilitated by some of these companies. So they operate with impunity. I don't think they may sometimes talk about the need for regulation. Sam Altman, the head of OpenAI, wanders around saying how important regulation is in relation to artificial intelligence, but doesn't really meaningfully do anything about that. I think it's largely window dressing, to be honest with you. Part of the problem is that we have scenarios where individuals are capable of acquiring billions of dollars to pursue passion projects, vanity projects, Elon Musk being one, but he's now situated himself as quite central to a number of different social crises that exist, one of which is, of course, social media, but the other is climate. And his capability or interest in responding to some of these crises will have a huge impact on how our policies respond. And that's an enormous problem. So inequality of wealth is not something that sits just apart from some of these questions that we're talking about. The fact that there are billionaires dictating policy solutions to some of the problems that we're discussing is an enormous problem for getting good outcomes, I think, in this field. And technology is a prime example, just because of the number of billionaires that it's produced and the billions of people that it's impoverished and enforced upon them human rights abuses. So I do want to just make that clear, that I think governments have a very big role to play in terms of managing wealth inequality at the very minimum, so that we can get to a world in which these kinds of megalomaniacs aren't in charge or are hugely influential in how we might respond to some of these problems. And the technology industry is a good example.
Chris, how do you respond to that? I mean, you sort of, we've been talking about the role of regulation and law, and I mean, the media is regulated. Sometimes people say over-regulated, and you talked about the imbalance of power in some situations. How do you respond to the comments that Lizzie and Brynn have made around that imbalance of power?
Well, I think it's one of these areas where journalists, at least, more than the media, have a responsibility, or on both sides, they're both contributing to the regulatory climate, if you want to, in a sense, by the way in which they can mobilise public opinion around particular stories. And there's some kind of quite exciting stuff happening by individual journalists or by small groups of journalists around the world that are doing that. I think particularly if you look at most of the reporting about the crisis in the Amazon Orinoco basins, which are part climate change, part social, part everything. Most of that's been driven through a really powerful network of local, national new media and global investigative organisations. So there are ways in which journalists can actually practically intervene to help in regulation. I think one of the problems here in the Australian environment is that the media as an institution, that is traditional media as an institution, have used their political power and influence to regulate media in their own, to regulate technology in their own interests. So that the major and really the only regulatory initiative that's happened with technology companies in Australia has been to force them to pay old media money for as a kind of a shakedown, really, for as a price of operating. And of course, as we know now, they were happy to do that 3 years ago, but now are unlikely to continue to do that in the when those agreements come up for renewal next year. And that's going to be a crisis for the government, where they're wedged between large corporations that don't want to act and local corporations or corporations with local power that will want them to intervene. I think ultimately, when you're talking about technology or the large technology companies, it's only government that can regulate them, either at a global or at a sub-international level. For example, particularly, I think the work of the European Union is probably the most interesting in that space, and I think that will kind of set the ground rules in a large enough market to become a bit the global baseline, I think, for technology regulation. But one of the other things we need to consider is the role of courts and litigation in resolving this matter, because ultimately what is going to destroy News Corp, and is already close to destroying News Corp, has been the large-scale actions against them through the hacking cases in the United Kingdom, which has already cost News Corp over 2 billion Australian dollars, both in payouts and in their own legal costs. The large payout that they had to make to the Dominion Voting Systems case over fake news in the 2020 election already cost them $1.2 billion plus their own costs. And the forthcoming cases, the prosecutions against them and other media by Prince Harry and by and others in the United Kingdom, and of course the Smartmatic case in the United Kingdom, and most importantly, the shareholders' action against News Corp, against Fox at least, in the United States, which is seeking to say that it was a failure of management and controlling ownership of Fox News, that is the Murdoch family, who are responsible for this, and that they should reimburse Fox as a corporation for the costs that their actions incurred the company. So, yes, journalists need to play a role, need to think of their role, and I can talk a bit about the limitations on that in terms of journalistic practice. Journalists and media need to play a role. Governments need to play a big role because they're the only ones big enough to actually regulate. But also, I think we'll find that the courts will increasingly play a role in imposing the financial penalty. I might also add in the area of climate change, there's a really interesting example in which business or the business industry can play a role, which is the Hindenburg investigation and subsequent shorting of the Adani Group, which really didn't get much publicity in Australia, although, funnily enough, the improprieties they were identifying were occurring largely in and about Australia. So there are also, funnily enough, I think the financialisation of the world system does also provide a vehicle for some regulation or some accountability in these areas.
Justine, do you mind if I just jump in quickly? I just wanted to add to Chris's comment. I don't disagree that government is the only entity that's capable of regulating big tech companies that we know of. But what I would say is I think there are other things that government can do in addition to just making laws. They can invest in alternatives. They can create space for alternatives to evolve. They have a procurement capability that is rarely discussed or talked about in this context that is influential. And much in the same way that, many of us would like to see government invest in clean technologies for energy production to a greater degree. I think the same is true of the tech space. I mean, partly I spend so much of my life advocating around these issues because until we dismantle these systems, our public spaces are going to be dominated by mis and disinformation, by bad actors who are interested in preserving the status quo for their own vested interests, rather than having a genuine public discussion about how we might get into a position where we can face the climate challenges of the future, where, we have racial and social justice, all these kinds of things. And at the moment, I think the tech space, the tech industry is limiting the capacity for public space to be properly developed. Government has a role to play in investing in building out alternatives for places in which we can congregate and discuss these things, have a shared sense of truth or an understanding of the challenges that we face. And they've done it before. I do think an overwhelming investment in the ABC would be a good money well spent for this kind of purpose, experimenting in alternative forms of communicating with people, not just traditional one-to-many kind of journalism, but lots of different ways in which we could experiment. I've written about this with other activists in this space, talking about how you could build a public digital square that is functional, or at least it has the right starting point, that it wants to create accountable public spaces that discuss the breadth of these issues, rather than catering to the interests of shareholders, catering to the interests of advertisers, which is essentially the motivation for a lot of the owners of these spaces.
Can I say I agree with everything Lizzie said there, except for her enthusiasm about the ABC. Because I actually think the ABC.
It's good to have disagreement, Chris.
I think the ABC is effectively no longer fit for purpose, either for its the historical purpose that it had, or for taking on these new responsibilities. And I think we need to be looking at ways in which, I agree, governments can intervene and do this, but I'm not sure that that the ABC is right. And that's a bit because my view of the way old media has adapted to the new world is that almost in every case they have failed to adequately to be fit for purpose. And so I don't know why we should assume that the ABC will be any different without substantial internal and external changes to the ABC. It may well be actually that the SBS, which is traditionally a much more community-based public broadcaster, would be, if you wanted to start from something that was already there, would be a better way of starting than dealing with the dead hand of bureaucracy that continues to act like be a dead weight on the ABC.
Larissa, do you want to jump in here? Because I mean, I think you've been, particularly dealing with this in the last few months, where in the media we've been seeing this endless, striding for balance around issues. Like if we have one yes, we have one no campaigner. We have this, and and it's not always actually giving perhaps a correct views or giving that endless strive for balance. Is that what we need in this area? Is that what civil society needs to advance accountability? Is balance always the answer? How do you deal with that in your own work?
Yeah, I mean, I have a lot to say on it. I think that this referendum campaign hopefully is a good point of reflection for the media in Australia and how they've covered this debate and actually created the terms of this debate. And I think I agree a lot. You can have billions of more dollars into the ABC, but I really think about the way that they have gone like this kind of one-for-one, and the idea that you have like someone who's for a yes and then someone who says absolute extreme views, and the idea that those two things are the polar ends of the debate and those are the ones that should be heard is so damaging. I was looking at some headlines the other day around, we're talking about the stuff around Clive Palmer, how he tried to do the court challenge around the idea that a cross should equal a no. And so much of the reporting was talking about, Clive Palmer doing this and, giving him so much space. I think the media also, particularly not just the ABC, but I think the media is intimidated on how it covers people who have a lot of power in this country as well. And I think about, NITV and Indigenous media, and, there was part of a call out that we did early in the piece in the referendum where we said, the role of Black media was set up as protests to give our communities a voice, right? And thinking about actually the media as a fourth estate isn't to referee this fight. It's actually to give people the information that's needed here. And it so overwhelmingly, we're out in polls in remote communities in regional Australia, and people are just like, I have no idea what this thing is about. What is it about? And just that information has not cut through. And I think that is so damaging, but I don't necessarily know that that media are going to be the kind of, I don't know if they're going to be the people that are going to bring the truth through in the right way, or kind of have the courage to actually articulate these fights in the same way, or look too partisan when actually we do need to. And I think there was some reflection when you look at the way that the US media had covered Trump, or how they covered the debate in the UK around Brexit and that sort of stuff, and really took stock of actually we contributed to the situation where people post those votes were like, we were misled. The media had a huge role in that. And I do believe this referendum is, from the conversations I'm having and you're looking at the way that the vote, I think people are going to be really shocked around what is the result of this referendum and what was the intention of this referendum. We've turned this debate into a debate on what First Nations people deserve. And in that debate, First Nations people have not been platformed adequately, you're going to the hand-selected people versus going to communities and understanding, the idea that you can cover like the progressive no. And that's like, we pushed really hard for other voices to be covered within this debate, because there needs to be some balance here. And it is totally fine to have a bunch of Aboriginal communities coming together and saying this isn't good enough. Overwhelmingly, people in this country do not understand the oppression and dispossession that is our lived experience. And so, I see the space of mis and disinformation, how, influential it can be in our communities, because we have a lived experience of not being able to trust government. And so I think there's a lot of things, you look at the corporate sponsorship as well that comes around the referendum. I think that has played a huge role in not just us, but other communities not trusting the amount of mining companies that are paid into this. And for, our communities, you look at the most influential people on Aboriginal policy, Twiggy Forrest, looking at social reform, CDP. Look at the last amendment to the Native Title Act was called the Adani Amendment when it was brought in, and the work that George Brandis did to retrospectively change the way decisions were made across the native title. We've had a lot of influence from business councils, from corporate Australia, media, who haven't told the truth. And, part of this debate when it started around the referendum, going off on a tangent, but look at the situation that happened in January around Alice Springs and people covering what was, grog everywhere. But there was no coverage in the media that there had been massive floods in remote communities, this huge climate disaster, the idea that people were unhoused and thousands of people got moved into Alice Springs, had nowhere to go. And so obviously there was dysfunction there. yes, it's exacerbated by, not having any services there and already the issues that are there, but the way that it is covered, and you have, Peter Dutton coming out and calling for, an inquiry into child sex abuse in Aboriginal communities. And it's just like, hang on a minute, that is part of the referendum debate that you're trying to start here, because it works to, put Aboriginal people at a disadvantage and use us for your own political gain. But there was no calling out of that in the media. So I don't, media regulation, or whether media are actually going to be the people. This is why I think we need to do more work around organising in civil society and building that back up, because post-pandemic, people are terrified of having real conversations with people. And I think there's so much work to do there.
So that's a perfect lead in, because we're coming near the end of this, and you're sort of this, where we go next in terms of your work in each of your areas. So Siobhan, if I was starting with you, if you were thinking about how you need to adjust your practice or adjust your work in relation to this sort of impunity around accountability, to deal with, and often dealing with, human rights and social abuses. How do you see having to adjust to that? Because the accountability is not always there, whether it's government or corporations or through regulation. And when we've talked about the value of law in being a regulator, but we haven't actually also talked about the value of law in oppressing, protest, which Australian states around the country have got increasingly draconian laws prohibiting protest, particularly around climate protests, but other protesters as well. So law can be this sort of, work both ways. We've given it a bit, perhaps more of a gloss. So how do you think about your work and how you have to adjust to deal with accountability deficits?
Yeah, look, I mean, so often we will work through kind of issues or positions where we might take a position that's beyond the requirements of the law. I guess an example for us was some years ago, we were particularly concerned around the harm, for example, of payday lending. There was no law making that activity necessarily illegal. Regulators were giving it some focus. And we worked through that over a number of years and actually ended up taking the position that this was not a sector that we wanted to operate in. And so we took that position ahead of the regulatory requirements. But we thought the risk of the harm, the fact that people were being harmed by this particular activity, that we needed to take a particular standard or level. I think when I go back and think about, and it took time, I think that's the other piece, is often these pieces of work, they're complex, not all stakeholders are going to agree with you. It does take some time to work through and to bring people with you around how you arrive at a final decision. I think on climate change, and I guess taking a slightly different approach, is also then how businesses can work together and also with civil society. And so I've been involved in the United Nations Environment Programme Finance Initiative, the Principles for Responsible Banking. We established those back in 2019. We now have half the world's banks supporting those principles. And what it means is that you're supporting Paris Agreement and the Sustainable Development Goals. But importantly, we also established a civil society advisory body. And at the time of setting that civil society advisory body up, when we were a small number of banks at that stage, there was a real resistance and a real nervousness around having dialogue with civil society. And I certainly was one of those people who said, no, this is really important. The importance of listening to civil society, understanding the issues that are emerging that civil society can hear about that we may not be able to listen to as well, but also giving us a view that then us as a group of banks can then listen to collectively and then work through solutions and methods together to set, if you like, voluntary standards around how we approach some of these topics has been really powerful. And look, we don't always get there. And certainly that civil society advisory body has given us feedback that we're not moving fast enough, but they've also called out specific issues where they've expected us to lean in. So 2 years ago, they provided commentary in our feedback report that we need to do more around nature. So, we've obviously done a lot of work around facing into the role of the task force on nature-related financial disclosures, but also we're now resetting the principles and we're shifting away from just the focus on climate and SDGs and getting much more focused around climate, nature, financial inclusion and human rights. And you can imagine that for some banks in some jurisdictions, this is a really, really complex topic. This is not a topic that they necessarily feel comfortable with. But the dialogue with civil society has been really powerful. The dialogue with other banks that are perhaps more progressed around this topic has also been really useful in order for us to then work through how do we then start to look at, I guess, shared frameworks or shared ways that we can move forward on these sorts of topics, ahead of what regulatory requirements need us to do. But actually as a sector, what ought we do, I think has been really quite an interesting and important approach.
Thanks. So I've got a minute from each of you now with your sort of your final comments on, you know, what would be the issue that you would like, you know, participants to take away from this discussion around either accountability deficits or where we're sort of moving in your particular areas of expertise. Lizzie, would you like to start with it?
Yeah, so I would say that the thing I probably neglected to discuss in this context is that there is a huge role to play in the capabilities unleashed by technology to give people a voice that otherwise were excluded, particularly from mainstream media. And I accept the criticisms of the ABC. And I think there's limits to which mainstream media and government investment in alternatives is able to deliver on the promise of human rights. And in fact, that there's enormous capabilities within technology. Like, you know, we're watching a war unfold in the Middle East, for example. We're getting a lot of disinformation being put out there as well as the capacity to hear from people, particularly in Gaza, who we'd never hear from by on normal standards, often in mainstream journalism as well. And, you know, that's true for police accountability and the like as well, where we've seen huge amounts of gains in terms of understanding the problem through the use of citizen media. And so what I do think is worth saying is that there is great potential in the development of technology to improve and elevate human rights. The question is, how is power within the industry being exercised, and what role does government have to either facilitate that kind of power or to limit it, to roll it back, to create alternatives that make sure that human rights are protected. And I would just want to finish with that. I think there's a real role for human rights to be protected as a result of new technology, and that there's a facilitation role that technology can play, but not if we leave the current baseline distribution of power untouched and unmodified and unregulated. And, you know, I agree with Brynn, there's an outrage factor there that probably needs to be stoked in order for that change to occur.
Great points. Brynn, would you like to provide us with your final thoughts?
So just on the criminalisation of protest and in defence of the ABC, I'd encourage everyone to watch Monday night's Four Corners, which was the ABC's coverage of the civil disobedience in relation to some activists in Western Australia protesting outside the home of Woodside CEO Meg O'Neill, and the incredibly disproportionate response of West Australian Police in relation to that. So go and have a look at it. In terms of what ACCR is doing on the accountability front, well, we are taking legal action. We have sued Australia's second largest oil and gas producer, Santos, for what we allege is the misinformation they have put into the market about their net zero plan. So keep an eye on that. The court will be hopefully making a decision in 2024. We're pursuing accountability for company directors. We think that company director elections are a really important moment, that institutional investors need to be voting for the right directors on company boards, and that the wrong directors need to lose their jobs. And finally, there's this myth out there that, you know, we have to communicate in soft and gentle ways for people to understand and accept and take up our message. We think that the answer, well, that's actually been disproven, and the answer is more science, not yes, more hard realities, more science, not less, more hard realities, not less, and more alarm, not less.
That's really clear. Thanks so much for that. Those great points. Chris, what would be your takeaways from this?
I think there's a big responsibility for journalists to rethink what we mean by journalism and how journalism works. And that's going to mean we need to rethink it from the bottom up. And I think we are already seeing a lot of that reform happening from the bottom up. Larissa referred to Australia's black media, which I think has been one of the most exciting innovations and changes in the media, almost totally outside and ignored by mainstream media. Very similar in the United States too, where most of the reform, particularly around the racial reconciliation, the racial reckoning in the United States, is occurring, are largely driven by some very exciting developments in Black-owned, Black-driven, Black-written media. So I think, and similarly in Europe, some of the most exciting stuff about the immigration crisis is happening from the bottom up. You can look at the big reforms in the dramatic change in Ukrainian media as a result of the collapse of the pro-Russian oligarch class in the war. And again, incredibly exciting things happening from the bottom up. Same happening in India. It's not happening in Australia for a whole lot of structural reasons. And it's not happening in journalists rethinking the way they do their job, but either in old media or in new media. And I think that's where we're going to see a fundamental change in journalism's role can't speak for media, but certainly journalism's role in accountability and dealing with the various the polycrisis in which we find ourselves.
That's a perfect segue to you, Larissa, with the reference to sort of what we need from the bottom up, which is very much your focus and your work and taking those voices out. So what would be your final thoughts around, you know, this concept of accountability and its relationship to human rights and where we're going in your work?
I think our job as civil society is to popularize this idea that another world is possible, the idea that we can build power for different changes and get people to understand how change happens, what is the role of governments and decision makers and that sort of stuff, but also to create campaigns where we give people viable ways to take action and also give people space to win, because if people don't win, we cut the power of our movements. And so we're very strategic in where we put our capacity. But I think more immediately, the focus on the referendum result for me is the thing that because there's one thing around building power, but there's also a role of disruption. And I think this result, the campaign has been what it is, and you can argue how the campaign was won, what the role of mis and disinformation was, the media and all that deserves a post-mortem, and we need that to happen here because it says something about this country, and absolutely international media will be looking at the result and making their judgments around what happened here and not have the nuance and understanding of, you know, what happened in that debate. But I think for us, you know, critically, there are a bunch of reforms for First Nations people that were on the table, looking at the bipartisan support around cultural heritage legislation at a federal level, looking at the different welfare reforms and housing investment. There has been huge attacks from the far right on Aboriginal controlled organisations, whether they should exist anymore. There was a Senate inquiry that lost by 1 vote, looking at kind of looking into our land councils and with a view of people that they should disband them. And the idea that our resources and our land tenure should be wrapped up into some other government process that isn't held by us. So I think there is a big attack. I think if we have a result in Victoria where the popular vote is under 50%, what does that mean for treaty in processes in Victoria? There are things I think that are at stake here. And I think if you don't understand what this representative body is, understand that the impact of this vote is going to send a message to every federal, state and territory government on whether or not Indigenous affairs is something that voters care about, and the debate is about us. So I would say also there's a huge role for persuasion here still, but the disruption and how we come together post this and actually draw a line in the sand around racism and the impact that it has had on this debate and how far it will take us backwards. I think we need to put our energy there and understand that if you didn't play in this referendum and were part of the campaign, but you believe in human rights, then there's a lot of work to do.
Thank you all so much for your expertise in this area. I believe that, what you've said is we know that Australia particularly is at this critical juncture right now in relation to human rights, but it's human rights intersection with many things. It's human rights and climate, it's human rights and tech, human rights and journalism, it's Indigenous rights, it's corporate responsibility. And we all, have a role that we can play to show that Australia is an inclusive country, is an equitable country where voices can be heard. And whether that's climate protests or Indigenous rights or balancing, sort of what media voices are heard. So thank you so much for your input today. It's much appreciated. Thank you all for joining us online today. And we're looking forward to seeing you, those of you who are joining us tonight for session 3 at the Art Gallery. Thanks for that. The Australian Human Rights Institute work. You can see more information on our website. Thanks for joining us today.